Hey, look everyone, it's a Sega Saturn. And we're gonna play a Sega Saturn game in this here Sega Saturn, because I haven't done that in a good long while. Alright, there we go, and...
I'm already having second thoughts now. Dark Legend, released in 1995 for the Sega Saturn courtesy of Data East, is a port of an arcade title called Soiku Endo or Outlaws of the Lost Dynasty, which is a fighting game whose cast of characters are all based on characters from Water Margin, one of the four great classical novels of Chinese literature, which also comprises Dream of the Red Chamber, Journey to the West, and Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Dark Legend has a one-player mode, a two-player mode, and an options menu where you could set the difficulty, the speed of the timer, and the number of rounds you get to win. There's no option to reconfigure the buttons, but since it's a Sega Saturn game and you're likely to be using those really nice Sega Saturn gamepads, I don't believe this to be a major omission, though some folks might, so something to keep in mind. Either way, it's a pretty no-frills fighting game with little in terms of additional modes, which isn't a surprise considering the time frame, and well, might as well dig deep into the game. Dark Legend gives you roughly a dozen fighters to choose from, each with their own specific weapons and set of basic and special attacks that can be used to beat the opposition to a pulp. It's pretty standard fare, your standard 6-button setup of 3 punch buttons and 3 kick buttons, a handful of special moves to learn, dashing forward, dashing backwards, taunting your opponent, playing possum with a fake dizzy, hop off projectiles for a little boost, pull off a desperation attack when you're low on health, and then there's this berserker mode where you'll flash, move really fast, and spam fireballs. Depends on the fighter, I suppose, because they never mention it in the manual. They do mention a beginner mode which you could access by holding down the 2 trigger buttons while picking your character, but I have no idea what it does. Apparently it makes the game easier and I don't know, it's a thing that's in the game. When you start a match, you are armed with a weapon. With the exception of a couple fighters, they have bodyguards instead. Whenever you block an attack, it drains your weapon gauge on the bottom of the screen, and when this gauge is empty, you'll be dizzied, you'll lose your weapon for the rest of the match, and will have to resort to close quarter fisticuffs. On the flip side, you could also throw your weapon at your opponent in an attempt to score a dizzying blow, and also resort to fisticuffs. Now on the one hand, losing your weapon means losing a special move or two among other advantages, but on the other hand, some fighters do benefit from being unarmed, and some even get a new move or two that they couldn't do with a heavy sword on hand. And unarmed fighters can also go into this berserker mode under certain conditions, so you could go either way. Dark Legend has a couple decent ideas going for it that makes it somewhat unique, but on a whole, it's just another decent fighting game that was lost in the shuffle. At first glance, it might seem somewhat derivative of SNK's more popular Samurai Shodown series, and while there may be an element of truth to that statement, it's not necessarily a bad thing. The game's competently executed for the most part, with a fairly solid fighting engine that runs at a decent pace, the hit detection's pretty solid. There's some juggling combos to be done if you care for that sort of thing. The fighters are varied and different enough that it's not terribly dull, and there's a bit of fun to be had here. Perhaps more importantly, control is pretty solid, responsive, smooth. I didn't have much of an issue pulling off special moves, which is your standard fare. What we have here is a perfectly acceptable, fairly decent little fighting game in Dark Legend, and if you come into this expecting just that and nothing more, then you'll be more than satisfied. On the flip side though, try to dig a little deeper and it's pretty slim pickings. In regards to the visual presentation of Dark Legend, it's a pretty decent looking game with some minor quibbles, but nothing too drastically major. You have some nice detailed character sprites of varying shapes and sizes, and they seem to move about and animate somewhat smoothly. Not quite silky smooth, but smooth enough that it isn't too jarring. Even the 3 brothers sharing the same body type and only having the head swap look not awkward. The various backgrounds aren't too shabby looking, and the scaling effect employed here does a nice job of showing off the scope of these levels, though it does feel a bit jumpy at times, especially when the action goes back and forth quite a bit. I've also noticed some backgrounds have this sort of grainy quality to it, almost like a low quality JPEG image or something to that extent. Whether this is a result of the porting to the Saturn or just the way it was in the arcade game, I wouldn't know without having played the arcade original. Other than that though, it looks alright. The fighters are adequately sized with the small guys being small, the big guys being big, and everything in between. No real complaints in this regard, it looks fairly decent. The sound department also fares well in Dark Legend, with a nice selection of varying background tunes ranging from fast-paced to somewhat somber sounding pieces. For the most part, it fits with the overall landscape of Dark Legend, while also keeping its foot within the realm of your standard fighting game sounding soundtrack stuff. The sound effects sound alright, as do the little voice bites for the various taunts and move calls and that sort of thing. Pretty standard fare all around, nothing too fancy or anything like that. It complements the gameplay just fine, even if it doesn't have the staying power that other fighting game soundtracks would have. Overall, Dark Legend is a somewhat competent little fighting game on the Sega Saturn. It plays well enough, it has a couple neat gimmicks that makes it different from the rest of the bunch, and it's quite a bit of fun actually. The game tends to be lost in the shuffle due to the number of other more well-known fighters on the system that blow Dark Legend out of the water, but the worst you could say about Dark Legend is that its average fare at worst that doesn't stand out from that somewhat crowded fighting game market, and also, it's on the cheap side of the spectrum last I checked. So if you're looking for another fighter on the Saturn outside of the usual suspects but don't want to pay a premium or two, why not give Dark Legend a shot? It's nothing mind-blowing, but it's a fine little fighter that's worth a shot or two.